For more than a century, the echoes of Fatima have resonated like a heavenly whisper that, far from fading, seems to intensify with each new world conflict, with each natural catastrophe, with each sign of apostasy within the church. In 1917, a woman dressed in white appeared in a small Portuguese town, bringing an urgent message to the world. The three little shepherds, Lucia, Francisco and Jacinta, witnessed something that would go beyond their childhood understanding, but whose weight would accompany them until death. They were entrusted with three secrets. The first, a vision of hell. The second, a warning about the Second World War and the need to consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. The third, a prophecy shrouded in mystery, officially revealed only in the year 2000, or so we were told. Because from that moment on, something didn't fit. Theologians, priests, seers and faithful began to raise a question that has never been clearly answered. Was the third secret revealed in its entirety? Or was there something else that was kept hidden, locked in the Vatican archives, for fear of its devastating contents? What if, behind the veil of silence and ecclesial diplomacy, there existed not only an unpublished part, but a fourth, much more disturbing revelation that has been deliberately kept quiet? Lucia dos Santos, the only one of the three shepherd children who lived to old age, was interrogated for decades. She wrote multiple letters, some sealed, others preserved at the direct request of heaven. Several of these communications have mysteriously disappeared, while others were published in a fragmented manner. There are testimonies from those who claim to have read unpublished texts that spoke of a great apostasy from the highest levels of the church, of an internal schism, of a spiritual war that would begin from within. Why were these fragments marginalized? Who benefits if we don't know what the Virgin really said? In 1957, priest Fuentes interviewed Sister Lucia. In that conversation, she spoke chilling words. The Holy Virgin is very sad because no one pays attention to her message. Neither the good nor the bad. The good continue their lukewarm path, and the bad go along the wide path of perdition. The Virgin can no longer stop the arm of her Son. This interview was censored, discredited by the clergy themselves. But why? What did it reveal that was so uncomfortable? Some researchers point to a fourth prophecy, never officially published, but mentioned in private testimonies and indirect references. This message would refer to a coming judgment, not only on the nations, but on the hierarchy of the Church itself. A message that speaks of two popes coexisting, of great doctrinal confusion, and of a final punishment that will affect the entire world if humanity is not converted. Even Lucia would have said that the punishment would begin in Rome. The pieces begin to fit when you look at the current landscape. Moral scandals within the Church, doctrinal divisions, spiritual relativism, and a growing loss of faith even among the consecrated. All humanity seems to have crossed the threshold of respect for the sacred, and yet the message of Fatima, with all its prophetic power, is treated as a story of the past, as if its fulfillment were not right before our eyes. Why this persistent silence? What are you trying to protect or cover up? A Vatican exorcist once stated that the devil deeply fears Fatima because he knows that that message contains heaven's strategy to defeat him. It is no coincidence that so many later Marian apparitions, Garabandal, Akita, St. Nicholas, reprise and amplify the warnings given at Fatima. And it is no coincidence that many of these messages have also been silenced. Are we facing a spiritual conspiracy, or simply faced with a truth so hard that humanity is not prepared to hear it? What is undeniable is that heaven continues to speak, and that the silence of the earth is increasingly deafening. Perhaps what we know as the third secret is not the last. Perhaps there are more, and we are living the fulfillment of that fourth, unwritten, but lived revelation. Many have dared to connect the dots. Others prefer not to look. But the question is raised, and its weight is inescapable. What else did the Virgin say in Fatima that has not yet been revealed? And what do you think? Is the Church still secretly hiding a greater warning? Leave it in the comments and share this message if you think the truth can no longer be hidden. Are we ready for what's coming? In 1917, in a humble corner of Portugal called Cova da Iria, 3 shepherd children witnessed an event that would forever change the spiritual history of the world. Lucia dos Santos, 10 years old, and her cousins Francisco and Jacinta Marto, 9 and 7 years old, claimed to have seen a lady dressed in white, brighter than the sun, who asked them to pray the rosary every day to achieve world peace and the end of the war. That maternal figure, who appeared to them for 6 consecutive months, was none other than the Virgin Mary, who not only enveloped them in her heavenly light, but also entrusted them with secrets that, to this day, continue to cause amazement, debate, and mystery. The message of Fatima is officially recognized by the Church and has been the subject of numerous theological, historical, and spiritual investigations. The so-called Secret of Fatima was revealed in 3 parts. The first, a vision of hell, where the souls of the damned were shown, causing a deep impact on the children. The second part spoke of the end of the First World War, the possibility of a second if the world was not converted, and the need to consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. The third part was kept secret for decades, kept in the Vatican under strict measures, and was only revealed in 2000 by order of Pope John Paul II. According to the official version, this third part contained a symbolic vision, a bishop dressed in white who walks among corpses and ruins, climbs a mountain, and dies a martyr alongside other religious people. However, something about this revelation perplexed many. The content seemed more like an allegory than a direct prophetic message. Unlike the other 2 parts, it did not contain clear words from the Virgin, but rather a freely interpreted vision. For many scholars and faithful, this did not agree with what Lucia had advanced for years, that the third secret was related to a crisis of faith within the Church and to the punishment that would come if there was no conversion. Cardinal Ratzinger himself, later Benedict XVI, suggested that the message may not have been fully understood. And it is precisely here where the enigma arises. Is it possible that the third secret has not been revealed in its entirety? Could there be content still hidden, unpublished, that due to its severity has been considered inappropriate for humanity? Many have dared to say yes. Various sources, including testimonies from clerics and experts who accessed internal documents, maintain that the most striking part of the message was not a vision, but a written text, a letter from Lucia that contained the Virgin's own words. In this supposed letter, the Virgin warned of a great apostasy within the Church, a loss of faith that would begin from its own domes. There would also be mention of a possible infiltration of dark forces into the ecclesiastical hierarchy, and a divine judgment that would fall on the world if it was not responded to with prayer, penance, and conversion. Lucia, for years, asked that this message be revealed before 1960, arguing that by then it would be clearer. However, when the date arrived, the Vatican decided not to publish the content. The official reason was that the message was not urgent, but this decision generated even more suspicion. What could the text contain that made it so difficult to communicate? Why so many silences, contradictions, and different versions over time? The questions don't stop there. Some reports speak of the existence of 2 documents, one with the symbolic vision published in 2000, and another with a literal text which has never been disclosed. It has even been said that when Pope John Paul II read the entire contents, he spent a night in prayer, deeply moved, and that from then on he consecrated his pontificate to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. It is also said that Paul VI read the message and placed it back in the archives with an expression of extreme regret. The content of this possible hidden message has been partially reconstructed from indirect sources. Among them, Father Fuentes' interview in 1957 stands out, where Lucia stated that many nations will disappear from the face of the earth, and that the final battle between good and evil would be fought around the family and the church. This interview was discredited by the ecclesiastical hierarchy, and Sister Lucia was silenced for years. He was not allowed to talk about the content of the secret without prior authorization. Who was bothered by his voice? What truth was he trying to communicate? The enigma of Fatima is not only a theological puzzle, but a spiritual key for our times. The possibility of an as-yet unrevealed message resonates more strongly in a world that seems to have forgotten God. The growth of relativism, the loss of the sense of sin, unbridled violence, wars that multiply, and internal crises within the Church are signs that seem to respond directly to what Fatima would have anticipated. Today, more than a century later, the message of Fatima has not lost its validity. On the contrary, it appears to have entered a new stage of compliance. The story is not over. Heaven is still waiting for an answer, and until everything that was said is revealed, many will continue to wonder, what else do we know that we have not yet been told? And you? Do you think there is still something that the Church has not revealed about Fatima? Write your opinion in the comments. Your discernment can enlighten others. In December 1957, Mexican priest Father Agustin Fuentes visited Sister Lucia dos Santos in the convent of Coimbra, Portugal, with authorization from the local bishop. At that time, Father Fuentes had been designated as postulator for the beatification causes of Jacinta and Francisco Marto. The meeting was formal, documented and authorized. However, the consequences of that interview marked a before and after in the history of the Fatima apparitions, not so much because of what was said, but because of what came after, the imposed silence, censorship, and suspicion. During that conversation, Sister Lucia did not utter ambiguous words or soft formulations. He spoke urgently, with a spiritual and prophetic charge that went beyond the usual tone in his previous messages. He did not limit himself to reviewing the events of 1917, but delved into what he considered the content of the Virgin's message not yet understood or assumed. He spoke of the imminent punishment, the need for prayer and penance, and the apostasy that would spread even within the Church. One of the most shocking points was his statement that the devil is fighting a decisive battle against the Virgin, and that this battle focuses on attacking consecrated and priestly souls in particular. According to Lucia, if these souls fall, they drag many others with them. Furthermore, he added that they were reaching the last remedy that God gives to the world, the Holy Rosary and devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. These words resonated with apocalyptic force, not because they announced the end of the world as an imminent event, but because they signaled a definitive decision, conversion or perdition. The full content of the interview was published months later by Father Fuentes himself, causing a stir in Catholic circles. It was not long before ecclesiastical authorities in Portugal issued an official statement disavowing the priest and denying that Lucia had said such things. It was even stated that Sister Lucia had not said anything that had not already been published. That raised suspicions. Why, if his words were harmless or well-known, was it deemed necessary to issue a statement to contradict them? Why was the priest removed from his position as postulator? Researchers who have followed the case see this ecclesiastical intervention as a clear sign of censorship. Starting in 1959, the figure of Lucia was isolated from public contact. All communication had to pass through ecclesiastical filters, and his letters began to be reviewed. Access to it was restricted, even for close members of the Church. Lucia, who previously wrote directly to bishops and trusted lay people, was engulfed in a kind of administrative closure. It was evident that his words had struck a dangerous chord which should not resonate beyond the walls of the convent. One of the most controversial topics addressed by Lucia was the repeated mention of a crisis of faith within the clergy. He said clearly, "Father, the Blessed Virgin is very sad because no one pays attention to her message. The good must unite to be strong. The devil knows that religious people and priests who neglect their beautiful vocation drag many souls to hell." These words, in the context of the 20th century and the post-conciliar changes that were to come, were too prophetic. They pointed out precisely the spiritual root of the future crisis, not an external persecution, but an internal weakness, a corruption of testimony. Lucia herself seemed aware of the gravity of the historical moment. Her tone in the interview was not that of a fearful or exaggerated woman, but that of a messenger who, out of obedience, had remained silent for years and now found a space to speak. He told Father Fuentes that punishment was imminent if the world was not converted, and that many did not believe in the effectiveness of prayer because their faith had cooled. The insistence on praying the rosary was not devotionalism, it was a spiritual shield. And his call to penitence was not extreme asceticism, it was an urgent plea to divert the course of history. The official reaction, however, was lapidary. Not only the content, but the credibility of the interviewer was questioned. Statements were written in Lucia's name without clear evidence that she had written them personally. Differences in style, different signatures, and even internal inconsistencies arose in the later texts attributed to the seer. This has led some researchers and worshippers to suspect that Lucia was silenced, and that what was presented as her voice in the following decades may not have been entirely genuine. The 1957 interview, therefore, is not just another document about Fatima. It is perhaps the last time we hear Lucia's voice without filters, without previous writing, without the editorial hand of third parties. It is a statement that reveals a tension between the prophetic voice and the ecclesial structure, between spiritual truth and diplomatic prudence. And that tension remains valid today. The story of this censored interview raises many questions that remain without official answers. What did the so-called third secret of Fatima really contain? And why was there such a delay in revealing it? What role did authorities play in silencing a key witness to one of the most important apparitions of the 20th century? Was it just pastoral prudence or a deliberate desire to hide warnings that could have caused discomfort? Now tell me in the comments, do you think Lucia was silenced for telling a truth that was too uncomfortable for her time? Or do you think that the Church acted rightly to protect the faithful from alarmist interpretations? Throughout the 20th century, few testimonies have aroused as much interest, suspicion, and controversy as the writings attributed to Sister Lucia dos Santos, the main visionary of Fatima. While a significant portion of his correspondence and spiritual reflections have been officially published by the Vatican and other ecclesiastical sources, there is no small portion of documents whose whereabouts remain shrouded in mystery. Letters, notes, and personal diaries that, according to different investigators and witnesses, contained warnings and revelations that went beyond what had already been disclosed. What did those texts contain? Why did they disappear? Who could they have inconvenienced? This investigation delves into the missing fragments, into the silenced words, into the ink that did not reach public light. One of the episodes most mentioned by those who have closely followed the story of Fatima is that of the alleged letters that Lucia would have sent to various prelates, including Pope Pius V, and which were never answered or disclosed. In these letters, according to testimonies collected by the priest Joaquin Maria Alonso, who had access to the Coimbra archives, Lucia would have expanded details about the punishments announced by the Virgin, the role of Russia in the divine plan, and an even greater mystery related to the loss of faith within the Church. However, these texts, which at the time were the subject of analysis by theologians and researchers, were never officially published. Some claim that they were archived in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, others which were simply destroyed to avoid scandal. A particularly disturbing case revolves around a letter that, according to multiple sources, Lucia would have written in the 1940s, referring to a final crisis within the ecclesiastical hierarchy that would precede the total fulfillment of the secrets. The document would have been sent to Rome confidentially, but it was never mentioned in the official reports on Fatima. Father Alonso, in his memoirs, referred to this letter as the most severe warning ever written by Sister Lucia. The fact that said text disappeared fueled theories of a cover-up and even allegations of manipulation of the original message. Another intriguing element is the testimony of some nuns from the Carmel of Coimbra, who stated that Lucia wrote frequently, even in her last years, about visions and interior lights that she continued to receive. These writings, which in principle would have been preserved in his cell after his death in 2005, would have been quickly transferred by ecclesiastical authorities without leaving a trace. What type of content did they have? Was the seer receiving new revelations about the future of humanity, the destiny of the Church, or even about the imminent fulfillment of the third secret? The possibility that there are reserve writings prepared by Lucia to be opened only after her death has also been considered by various researchers. Some claim that these texts were sealed and marked with future dates, with the intention that they would be revealed at critical moments for the Catholic faith. However, no ecclesial authority has confirmed the existence of such documents, which has generated greater skepticism and at the same time renewed interest in scrutinizing the Vatican archives, especially after the partial opening of some documents during the pontificate of Benedict XVI. It is also relevant to highlight the differences in style and content between some texts attributed to Lucia. Specialists in textual analysis have pointed out that certain official writings, especially those related to the interpretation of the third secret, present an unusual tone and structure compared to other letters signed by her. This discrepancy has caused some to raise the possibility of intervened authorship, or even of writings written under strict supervision, thus limiting the psychic's freedom of expression. Even more disturbing is the testimony of people who visited Lucia in her old age and who reported that she herself was unaware of parts of what was published in her name. A document that has generated great controversy is an alleged letter addressed to John Paul II, in which Lucia would have begged the Pope to explicitly consecrate Russia as the Virgin would have requested, without ambiguities or diplomatic detours. Although the Vatican declared that the 1984 consecration fulfilled what was requested at Fatima, this letter, which was never officially recognized, would question that claim. According to those who claim to have had partial access to it, Lucia warned that without a clear and exclusive consecration to Russia, the promised conversion will not occur and errors will continue to spread. In addition, signs have been reported of a spiritual notebook in which Lucia would have compiled mystical reflections on the end times, the appearance of the Antichrist, and a necessary purification within the Church. Several indirect witnesses mention the existence of this notebook as an open secret among those who lived with her. Despite calls for canonization and the ongoing beatification process, such material was never mentioned in official reports or included in documents published by the Holy See. All of this raises a disturbing question: how much of Fatima's original message has actually been communicated to the world? What motivations might have led to the suppression of words that perhaps would have prepared the faithful for times of great spiritual tribulation? The story of Lucia's lost fragments not only reveals an ecclesial drama, but also a battle between prophetic transparency and institutional interests. Now I ask you, if these writings were to come to light today, would we be spiritually prepared for what they contain? Or do we prefer to continue ignoring what can shake our false security? Leave your reflection in the comments. For centuries, various prophecies have pointed out a time of great confusion within the Church, a period where even the figure of the Pope would not be exempt from controversy. Private revelations, mystical testimonies, and Marian messages have repeatedly warned of an internal division that would shake the foundations of the Vatican. This fracture, often symbolic, other times visible, seems to have found an echo in recent years with the coexistence of two papal figures in Rome, an emeritus pope and a reigning pope. Can this situation be interpreted as the fulfillment of ancient prophetic warnings? What does seeing two white-robed shepherds in the same flock mean spiritually for the faithful? When Benedict XVI announced his resignation in 2013, the Catholic world was taken aback. It was not only an unprecedented act in modern times, but a decision that seemed to give shape to a scenario that until then was unthinkable: the simultaneous presence of two popes in the Vatican. Although one of them, the Pope Emeritus, no longer exercised the active authority of the position, he retained his title, his white cassock, and his residence within the Vatican state. This coexistence raised theological, canonical, and prophetic questions. For many, it was not a mere institutional transition, but the beginning of a time in which the waters of faith would begin to stir with greater intensity. In the vision of Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich from the 19th century, a church divided in two was described. She spoke of a false church, an ambiguous pope, and a spiritual confrontation in the heart of Rome. Although his visions must be interpreted with discernment, there are many who saw in his description a disturbing similarity with today: a pope who governs with a different pastoral style, and a retired pope whose figure continues to be a spiritual reference for many Catholics. The tensions that this double presence has generated are not minor. Groups within the clergy and laity themselves have aligned themselves around one or the other, opening a rift that is reflected in doctrinal, liturgical, and moral positions. The third secret of Fatima, officially revealed in 2000, describes a figure dressed in white, walking among ruins, pursued, dejected. Although the official interpretation indicated that this image referred to St. John Paul II and the attack suffered in 1981, many scholars and faithful have pointed out that the description seems broader and apocalyptic, perhaps referring not to a specific event, but to an era of ecclesial suffering. Is it possible that the bishop dressed in white alludes to this double papal figure, to this ambiguity that confuses and disorients? The tension is not limited to the visual or symbolic. During the years in which Francis has been at the head of the Church, there have been statements, documents, and decisions that have generated controversy among traditionalist sectors, who have found in Benedict a clearer and firmer doctrinal reference figure. This has even caused some to question the validity of the current pontificate, fueling theories that, although unofficial, circulate strongly in Catholic circles. In this context, the figure of Peter seems, in the eyes of many, fragmented, and the rock that was supposed to be a sign of unity appears cracked by opposing visions of the same gospel. Benedict XVI's resignation also brought with it a change in the understanding of the Petrine ministry. He himself, on several occasions, expressed that he did not completely abandon his mission, but rather lived it differently in prayer and meditation. This statement, far from reassuring, opened a space of theological uncertainty. Can there be two popes, even if one is retired? What spiritual consequences does this duplicity have for God's people? The prophecy of St. Malachi, with its enigmatic list of popes, mentions a Peter the Roman as the last pontiff before the final judgment. Is this the time we are living in? The perception of a divided church is not just an internal matter. At a global level, scandals, moral ambiguity, the vocational crisis and growing secularization have caused the Church's witness to lose strength in many regions. Pope Francis himself has spoken of a church on the way out, in reform, but also of a wounded church. However, what kind of reform can be sustained if there is no deep unity between its pastors and their doctrine? The Akita prophecy, recognized by the Church, warns that the devil will infiltrate even the Church, and that cardinals against cardinals, bishops against bishops will be seen. This fracture beyond the visible points to a spiritual struggle for the very soul of the Church. In many Marian messages of the 20th century, such as La Salette, a disturbing idea is repeated. Rome will lose faith and become the seat of the Antichrist. Although this expression has been the cause of much controversy, it contains a call for attention to not forget that fidelity to the gospel is not guaranteed by the institution, but by the continuous conversion of its members. In this sense, the coexistence of two popes can be seen as a test of discernment for the faithful. Are we seeking security in human figures or in Christ, the true head of the Church? This unprecedented stage in the history of the Church also coincides with a global increase in apocalyptic phenomena: wars, pandemics, natural disasters, economic crisis, and loss of values. The chaos in the world seems to mirror the chaos within the heart of Catholicism. Some see this as part of the great deception prophesied by St. Paul, where even the elect could be confused. At this time, faith can no longer rely on visible structures alone. It must be born from intimacy with God, from prayer, from sacrifice, from the Holy Rosary, and from a life of penitence. Pope Francis has insisted many times on the value of synodality, of walking together, of listening to the Holy Spirit in community. But for many, this synodal path seems to be accompanied by changes that dilute ancient certainties. On the other hand, the figure of Benedict remained a silent beacon that many interpreted as the last bastion of a pre-conciliar church, or at least more rooted in tradition. This tension between continuity and change, between fidelity and evolution, between clarity and ambiguity, embodies the current drama of Rome, the spiritual center of the Catholic faith. And you, do you believe that this duality of popes is part of a divine plan or a great confusion that must be discerned? Write it in the comments. In many of the Marian revelations accepted or studied by the Church, punishment is not presented as a vengeful act of God, but as a profound form of spiritual correction. And the most shocking thing is that according to several of these revelations, said punishment does not begin in the secular world, but within the Church itself. An idea that, although disconcerting for some, has been recurring in prophetic messages such as those of Fatima, La Salette, and Akita. Is it possible that the purification of the world must first go through painful pruning in the very house of God? The Virgin Mary at La Salette in 1846 stated with overwhelming clarity that Rome would lose faith and become the seat of the Antichrist. A phrase that was minimized or even censored for a long time, but which has resurfaced in contemporary analysis as a severe warning about a spiritual decadence initiated at the highest peaks of ecclesiastical authority. In Fatima, although the third secret was officially revealed in the year 2000, many scholars and faithful maintain that the disclosed content is incomplete, since it would not include the part in which the Virgin would have warned about a great apostasy that would begin from the top. This idea of a spiritual punishment that begins within the Church also finds echo in the words of Sister Lucia, visionary of Fatima. In her 1957 interview with Father Fuentes, Lucia expressed that the final battle between the Lord and the kingdom of Satan would be about family and faith. But he also spoke of a very severe purification that would first affect the consecrated, the priests and bishops, because the enemy knew that if he managed to corrupt the clergy, he would drag countless souls with him. Purification, then, is not just punishment, but divine justice that comes from those who have the most spiritual responsibility. In Akita's message, approved by then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the Virgin uttered shocking words: "The work of the devil will infiltrate even the Church in such a way that cardinals will be seen against cardinals, bishops against bishops, churches and altars will be looted." This description not only alludes to doctrinal divisions, but to an internal struggle of a spiritual and moral nature in which those who should guide the people of God could become instruments of confusion. It is no coincidence that judgment begins at the house of God. As Scripture says in 1 Peter 4:17, "The time of judgment has begun, and it begins at the house of God." In this context, spiritual punishment is understood as a painful but necessary purification, a process in which structures that are not firm in the truth of Christ will be shaken. These are not just scandals or personal sins of clerics, although that is serious enough. It is something deeper, a crisis of identity, of doctrine, of faith. Confusion about truth, moral relativism, spiritual lukewarmness and worldliness have weakened the witness of the Church in the world. And like a mother correcting her child, God allows this process of purification so that the Church can once again be light in the midst of darkness. Various prophetic voices have confirmed this intuition. Father Stefano Gobbi, founder of the Marian priestly movement, received interior locutions that spoke of a great purification that would begin within the Church and would reach its climax when the schism manifested itself publicly. Also, Pope Benedict XVI, in a reflection from 1969, when he was still a theologian, anticipated that the Church of the future would be small, poor, persecuted, but holier, as if a spiritual pruning was taking place that would eliminate everything that is sterile and make what still remains faithful flourish. Biblical history is also full of precedents where judgment begins with spiritual leaders. In the book of Ezekiel, the prophet sees a vision in which angels marked the foreheads of the righteous, but physical punishment began in the temple. In Revelation, the letters to the 7 churches reveal that Jesus examines his communities not according to human success, but according to their faithfulness. These signs show that spiritual cleansing, to be effective, must begin with those who are called to be an example. The great paradox is that this punishment, far from being simply an act of destruction, is an opportunity for repentance, for a return to the truth, for the rediscovery of the true face of Christ. When the tinsel of the institutional falls away, the essence remains. A church that bleeds, that suffers, but that also purifies itself to shine like gold passed through fire. And it is precisely this test that will distinguish the true pastor from the hireling, the faithful witness from the religious official, the true believer from the occasional sympathizer. As more Catholics become aware of these warnings, a call for discernment becomes urgent. It is not enough to observe the external signs. It is necessary to look inside, examine the heart, the life, the personal fidelity to prayer, the sacraments and the Word. If purification begins with the Church, it also begins with each of us. Nobody is exempt. The time of complacency has ended, and the Spirit cries out for souls that do not fear the fire of the crucible, because they know that the resurrection will come later. The Virgin does not warn out of desperation, but out of love. A love that does not tolerate lies, that cannot come to terms with the corruption of the soul, and that continues to cry for its consecrated children who have forgotten their first love. For this reason, many have begun to see in these times a final stage of ecclesial purification, not out of mere apocalyptic speculation, but because they feel, with fear and trembling, that God is already touching the structures to make them tremble, and that those who survive standing will do so because they are founded on the rock. What do you think? Do you think that spiritual purification has already begun within the church? I read you in the comments. When talking about the Marian apparitions of the 20th century, the name of Fatima resonates like a sacred echo that marked a before and after in the spiritual consciousness of millions of people. However, with the passage of time, other celestial manifestations have emerged, loaded with a similar, urgent, and often disturbing message. Akita in Japan, Garabandal in Spain, and San Nicolas in Argentina seem to pick up, expand, and confirm the call of the Virgin in Portugal, shedding new light on what some scholars consider a fourth revelation not yet officially disclosed. Is it possible that these prophetic echoes are scattered pieces of the same puzzle? Are we facing repeated warnings that the world has refused to listen to? In Fatima, in 1917, the 3 Portuguese shepherd children received messages that ranged from visions of hell to warnings about wars, persecutions of the church, and an urgent call to conversion. The so-called 3 secrets deeply marked the 20th century. However, it has been debated for decades whether all the content was actually revealed. Sister Lucia hinted that there was an undisclosed part that spoke of a great apostasy within the church. This partial silence has generated a concern that finds resonance in other Marian apparitions approved or under study on different continents and contexts. One of the most striking cases is that of Akita in Japan, where the Virgin manifested herself to Sister Agnes Sasagawa in 1973. The wooden image that wept human tears, blood, and sweat for years is already an extraordinary sign. But more than the physical phenomena, what shook the believing community was the message. The Virgin warned that if humanity did not repent, a punishment greater than the flood would come. He spoke of cardinals against cardinals, bishops against bishops, burning churches, and an internal purification in the church. Curiously, these words are very similar to the content that some claim would be in the unpublished part of the 3rd secret of Fatima. Is Akita then a confirmation of what was not wanted or could not be officially revealed? In Garabandal, between 1961 and 1965, 4 girls claimed to receive messages from the Virgin and the Archangel St. Michael. Although the Church has not yet given definitive approval, the content has been seriously studied by numerous theologians and seers. The Virgin spoke there of a warning that everyone would see and feel inside, like an illumination of conscience on a global level. Then a miracle would come, and if there was no conversion, a punishment. What is striking is that Lucia, according to some unofficial testimonies, would have also mentioned a future illumination of conscience that would prepare the world for a great spiritual decision. Again, an echo that suggests that the heavens repeat the same cry with different voices. Furthermore, Garabandal also spoke of a great crisis within the church, which would begin to become visible after a council. The temporal and thematic coincidences with Fatima are difficult to ignore. San Nicolas in Argentina is a Marian apparition officially approved by the Church in 2016. Maria del Rosario de San Nicolas, as she is known, manifested herself to Gladys Quiroga since 1983 with messages that many consider a continuity of Fatima. The Virgin spoke of the power of the Rosary, the value of sacrifice, but she also denounced the spiritual lukewarmness, the corruption of many consecrated persons, and the threat of spiritual communism that advanced in disguise. One of the most alarming messages said, "The devil has penetrated the heart of man and has reached the bosom of the church." These words directly evoke Fatima's warnings about Russia and apostasy within the clergy. Furthermore, the call to consecrate oneself to the Immaculate Heart, so central in Portugal, is repeated insistently in St. Nicholas. Is this appearance an update of the original message for a different generation? When all these Marian events are observed, a powerful impression emerges. The Virgin has not stopped speaking, These are not essentially new messages, but rather a merciful reiteration, adapted to the time, place, and spiritual conditions of humanity. Each apparition seems to confirm and develop aspects that were already contained in Fatima, especially those that were never fully revealed to the public. In Akita, the purifying punishment is shown. In Garabandal, the global notice. In San Nicolas, the internal crisis and the resistance of the faithful people. Everything points to the same spiritual process. The world has entered a critical stage where many souls will decide, and heaven, in its infinite patience, insists on bringing us back. It is interesting to note that in all of these cases, the messages were initially ignored, rejected, or delayed by the ecclesiastical authorities. As happened in Fatima, the fear of scandalizing or creating alarm has led to covering up or relativizing what could well be the maternal voice of Mary, crying out for the salvation of her children. Why is this pattern repeated? Why do so many messages coincide in warnings about apostasy, punishments, and a coming purification? Some scholars consider that what was not revealed at Fatima has to do with an internal spiritual war in the Church, a division so deep that it can only be resolved through divine intervention. And this is exactly what the other apparitions show. There is talk of a battle between good and evil within the same ecclesial body. It is not an external war, but a purification from the very heart of Christianity. Hence the seriousness of the silence that surrounds the possible fourth part of the secret. It is not only an apocalyptic message, but a denunciation that bothers those who should guard the truth. In this context, it is worth asking if we are experiencing the progressive fulfillment of these messages. The signs are everywhere: moral confusion, loss of faith, ecclesiastical scandals, wars, plagues, signs in nature. All this was announced. But are we listening? Are we responding with conversion, prayer, and reparation? The echoes of Fatima have not faded away. Today they resonate more strongly than ever from Japan, Spain, and Argentina, and perhaps also from other places not yet revealed, where heaven continues to search for souls willing to intercede for the world. And what do you think? Do you think Our Lady is speaking to us more clearly than ever, but we just don't want to hear? Write us your reflection in the comments. The term apostasy is not foreign to Holy Scripture or the writings of the Fathers of the Church. St. Paul mentions it explicitly in his second letter to the Thessalonians, when he warns that before the manifestation of the man of sin, a great apostasy will first come. Over the centuries, this warning has been interpreted as a massive betrayal of faith from within God's people, a kind of spiritual eclipse that obscures revealed truth. What was previously considered unthinkable, the practical denial of faith by those who should guard it, today seems to have become everyday. The deterioration of faith is not limited to the coldness of the faithful. It has infiltrated the very walls of the Church, manifesting itself in ambivalent teachings, disfigured liturgies, compromised silences, and pastoral postures that, instead of confirming believers in the truth, plunge them into a fog of confusion. Priests who no longer preach about sin, bishops who avoid talking about judgment or hell, theologians who justify the unjustifiable, and communities that celebrate what God condemns. This phenomenon is not simply human error. It is a prophetic sign. The Marian apparitions of the last century have insisted on this point. At La Salette, the Virgin said that Rome would lose faith and become the seat of the Antichrist. In Akita, Japan, he warned that the Church would be plagued by internal divisions so severe that cardinals would oppose cardinals and bishops would oppose bishops. And in Fatima, although the so-called third secret was never revealed in its entirety, many maintain that it contained precisely an announcement of this internal apostasy. Everything indicates that these are not disconnected events, but rather the same prophetic line that describes the times we are living in. One of the most alarming features of this apostasy is the silence of the clergy. It is not just that the truth is no longer firmly proclaimed, but rather a deliberate omission, a cowardly or complicit withdrawal from lies. One avoids correcting the error, one fears conflict, one seeks to please the world. In many dioceses, doctrinal fidelity has become a source of suspicion, while ambiguity is rewarded with promotions. This phenomenon has generated a feeling of abandonment among the faithful. Many lay people, scandalized, feel that their pastors no longer guide them clearly, and that the light that should shine from the altars has been covered by a thick fog of political correctness and moral relativism. This apostasy does not always manifest itself as an open denial of Christ. On the contrary, it is often dressed in a language of inclusion, compassion, and modernity. But it is precisely this subtlety that makes it more dangerous. The gospel is talked about, but its demand for conversion is mutilated. The love of God is preached, but his justice is omitted. A pastoral care of accompaniment is promoted, but without orientation towards the truth. Dialogue is canonized, but at the cost of silence about sin. Mercy is confused with permissiveness, and human respect replaces the fear of God. This doctrinal and pastoral slippage has concrete consequences. In many seminaries, future priests no longer receive comprehensive training in the fundamental truths of the faith. More importance is given to sociological analysis than to inner life. The result is a generation of insecure pastors, more concerned about not offending than saving souls. In parishes, confession has been abandoned, Eucharistic adoration reduced, and fasting forgotten. There is talk of ecology, migration, economy, but rarely is there talk of the devil, purgatory, or mortal sin. It is as if the spiritual alarm had been deactivated in the middle of the night. Pope Benedict XVI, in one of his homilies as Cardinal Ratzinger, noted that the greatest threat to the Church came not from external enemies, but from a dictatorship of relativism that infiltrated its interior. This relativistic dictatorship is no longer a future threat. It is installed. Good and evil are presented as matters of opinion, truth is diluted in nuances, and dogma is treated as an uncomfortable inheritance that must constantly be reinterpreted. But the most dramatic thing is that this process has been accompanied by apparent peace. There are no violent persecutions, no great formal schisms. However, the cancer of error spreads silently. As in the days of Jeremiah, peace, peace is proclaimed when there is no peace. The Church seems to sleep while the enemy sows tares among the wheat. And in the midst of everything, the faithful desperately search for a voice that confirms their faith, a clear preaching, a pastor who does not fear the wolves. Most Holy Mary, in so many of her appearances, has called her children to resist this darkness, not with rebellion, but with heroic fidelity, not with resentment, but with prayer and penance. His call is clear: cling to the Rosary, to the Eucharist, to the authentic magisterium. Do not be deceived by false shepherds or become accustomed to error. In times of confusion, obedience to revealed truth becomes a prophetic act. This time of apostasy has also been a time of revelation. It has been revealed who are the true shepherds and who are hirelings, who seek the glory of God and who seek to please the powerful, who are willing to give their lives for their sheep and who abandon the flock at the first roar of the world. The judgment begins at the house of God, and this judgment is already underway. Heaven has spoken, but many have chosen to remain silent. And that silence, in times of crisis, is already a form of betrayal. Do you also perceive this deafening silence within the Church? Do you feel like we are living the prophesied apostasy? Share your testimony in the comments. When the Virgin Mary appeared in Fatima in 1917, she spoke words that today resonate with alarming prophetic intensity. If they heed my requests, Russia will be converted and there will be peace. If not, it will spread its errors throughout the world, promoting wars and persecutions of the Church. This warning was not an isolated comment, but a profound revelation about the spiritual role of an entire nation within the history of salvation and the apocalyptic combat that the world is waging. The name Russia did not appear by chance. It was pointed out precisely in a geopolitical and spiritual context that had not yet reached its peak. But more than a century later, the question that many ask is, was the consecration of Russia really fulfilled? Was it enough? Or do errors continue to spread in more subtle and destructive ways? The request to consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary was transmitted to Sister Lucia clearly. It was not a symbolic gesture. It was an act that had to be carried out publicly, in unity with all the bishops of the world, as a spiritual shield that would put a stop to the plans of hell. For decades, there was controversy over whether later popes fully fulfilled this request. John Paul II performed an act of consecration in 1984 without directly mentioning Russia, but in communion with the bishops. Some maintain that it was accepted by heaven and that it caused the collapse of the Soviet bloc. However, other theologians, Marian analysts, and even voices within the Church have expressed doubts. The fall of communism did not bring about a true conversion of Russia, but rather a transformation of its spiritual influence. Is it possible that Russia's mistakes have mutated into new ideologies, systems of control, moral decay, or cultural manipulation? The spiritual war being fought today does not use only tanks and missiles. It is fought with narratives, with laws contrary to life, with ideologized education, with technologies that replace conscience. In this context, Russia continues to play a disturbing role. While some present it as a bulwark against the decline of the West, others see it as an instrument of global destabilization. In both cases, it remains an epicenter of mystery. The Virgin did not speak about the United States or China. He talked about Russia. Because? What does it mean for a nation to have the power to spread errors capable of dragging the world into wars and religious persecutions? It cannot be denied that, after the 1917 revolution, atheistic communism, born on Russian soil, became a global virus. Its essence was not simply political, but deeply spiritual. He denied God, persecuted faith, destroyed the family, and exalted the state as absolute. These principles did not disappear with the fall of the Berlin Wall. They infiltrated other contemporary ideologies, now without red flags, but with the same corrosive effects on morality and human dignity. Abortion, gender ideology, transhumanism, moral relativism were not born in Russia, but they expanded on the basis of the same rejection of God. It is as if the errors mutate, disguise themselves, adapt. But its spiritual origin still has a root, an organized rebellion against the divine order. The Virgin asked for the conversion of Russia, not its power. The question we must ask ourselves today is not only whether it was properly consecrated, but whether the fruits of that consecration are visible. Where are the signs of that conversion? Where is national repentance, reparation, the spread of the gospel from that marked land? Some may point to the resurgence of Russian Orthodoxy as a positive sign. But at the same time, the political use of religion, the restrictions on freedom of conscience, and the symbolic manipulation of the sacred cast a shadow over that interpretation. What is at stake is not just politics, but the very soul of nations. The world today is going through a spiritual storm, wars, pandemics, economic crises, but above all, a silent apostasy that is emptying the lives of millions of meaning. In this scenario, the consecration of Russia appears not as an event of the past, but as a pending key. Sister Lucia herself declared that the consecration was not a single act, but rather the beginning of a process of reparation, penance, and conversion. Even if the Papal Act of 1984 was valid in the eyes of heaven, the human response is still necessary. Conversion is not imposed. he hugs himself. Has Russia embraced the call of the Immaculate Heart? And have we, as a church, understood the seriousness of that message? Heaven itself warned that if the call was not heeded, punishments would come, and one of them would be war. Is it a coincidence that, in the 21st century, Russia returns to the center of the world conflict? Are we not seeing the specter of war rising again, with possible apocalyptic consequences? Beyond military strategies, what is at stake is a combat of invisible dimensions. The devil wants to divide, destroy, enslave. Mary wants to unite, save, liberate. The battlefield is no longer just in Eastern Europe, but in every heart that decides which voice to listen to. Therefore, rather than speculating about chronologies, we must listen to the urgent cry of Fatima. The consecration of Russia is also a mirror of our own dedication. Are we consecrated to the Immaculate Heart? Or do we continue to tolerate in our lives the errors that nation had to leave behind? The spiritual war will not be won with geopolitics, but with prayer, penance, and fidelity to God. Only in this way can we see the Virgin's promise fulfilled. In the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. What do you think? Do you think Russia has been truly consecrated and converted, or is there still a deeper response missing from the world? Write it in the comments. Since the apparitions of the Virgin Mary and Fatima in 1917, the Marian message has resonated with a tone of urgency and warning. In that simple place in Portugal, 3 shepherd children received not only heavenly visions, but also profound revelations about the future of the world. Among those revelations was a spiritual combat of apocalyptic proportions, a fight between light and darkness, where all of humanity would be drawn into taking sides. Many have read the message of Fatima as a call to conversion and peace. But those who have delved into the darkest aspects of these revelations, such as contemporary exorcists and psychics, warn that the message is much more radical. We are in the midst of the great final battle between good and evil, and the devil has deployed a carefully designed plan to destroy the human soul. One of the central elements in this spiritual combat is silence. Not the sacred silence of contemplation, but the silence of concealment, of censorship, of fear of the truth. The devil not only acts through obvious temptation, but sows confusion, moral relativism, and a growing indifference toward the sacred. Various exorcists have warned that in their encounters with the demonic, evil entities manifest fierce hatred towards the Virgin Mary, especially when Fatima is mentioned. Why does this particular apparition arouse such fury in hell? Because there, an unbeatable spiritual weapon was offered to humanity, the Rosary, the consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary and penance as a shield against darkness. Father Gabriele Amorth, a renowned Vatican exorcist, stated that in multiple exorcisms the demons confessed, under divine obedience, that they fear Mary more than the saints themselves, because in her humility and purity she completely disarms their plans. According to Amorth, Fatima represents a strategic point in the eschatological battle, because there the conditions were revealed to avoid the perdition of millions of souls. However, ecclesiastical silence and widespread skepticism have allowed the infernal plan to advance almost without opposition. The greatest triumph of the devil is not war or violence, said Amorth, but to make men stop believing in his existence. Added to this testimony are the visions of Sister Lucia, who warned in her letters and private conversations that the final combat would focus on marriage, family, and the priesthood. These essential structures of the divine order would be the target of an unprecedented demonic offensive. And so it has happened. In the name of a misunderstood freedom, laws contrary to life and natural truth are promoted, while the value of sacrifice, chastity, and fidelity disappear from dominant discourses. The strategy is clear. Disfigure the image of God in humanity. Some current psychics have confirmed this reading. In Akita, Japan, Our Lady warned that times would come when shepherds would attack other shepherds, and that punishment could no longer be avoided if the world did not repent. In Garabandal, the warning was spoken of as an act of mercy before the judgment, a moment in which every soul will see its real spiritual state. In San Nicolas, Argentina, the Virgin cried out that the time of darkness had begun. These apparitions, far from contradicting each other, are linked together as prophetic pieces that confirm the central message of Fatima. The world is in a decisive spiritual battle, and many have fallen asleep. The devil's tactics not only include the seduction of sin, but also infiltration within the ecclesial body itself. According to revelations approved by bishops and supported by saints like Padre Pio, there will be a great apostasy from within, and those who were supposed to protect the flock will sometimes be instruments of confusion. This generates a deep fear in the faithful. The fear of looking the truth in the face, because accepting the existence of evil, hell, and spiritual combat implies assuming personal responsibility. It involves abandoning the comfort of a superficial faith and embracing a life of prayer, fasting, and reparation. The fear of the truth is not only psychological, it is spiritual. In exorcisms, demons tremble before the proclamation of eternal truths. Christ has conquered. Mary is immaculate. The blood of the Lamb has power. Simple truths, but loaded with spiritual fire. That is why the enemy has planted a culture of subjectivity, where objective good no longer exists, and everything depends on feeling or context. This moral fog is the ideal terrain for their destructive action. Fatima, in this context, is not only a place of devotion, it is the spiritual epicenter where heaven opened a war map. And that map indicated concrete weapons, the daily recitation of the Rosary, devotion to the Immaculate Heart, frequent confession, the restorative Eucharist, and the sacrifices offered for sinners. None of this is popular. Everything goes against the flow. And yet, it is all part of God's plan to counteract the devil's plan. When Mary showed hell to the little shepherds, she did not do it to terrify, but to awaken. Today, many prefer to deny its existence rather than do what is necessary to avoid it. There is also a prophetic dimension at play. Various mystics have affirmed that we are on the threshold of the final fulfillment of Fatima. The victory of the Immaculate Heart is still missing, but it will come preceded by a great purification. And that purification, like all true cleansing, will begin in the house of God. The temples, the hierarchies, the false securities will be shaken. But from this trial, a small, humble, faithful people will emerge, who will resist in the name of eternal love. Have you asked yourself if you are truly aware of this spiritual battle? Or do you prefer to continue living in a comfortable illusion while the forces of evil advance? Write to us in the comments. Do you also feel that silence and confusion are part of this infernal plan? At the heart of the Marian messages that have shaken the world from Fatima to Akita, the same plea is insistently repeated: conversion, reparation, and vigilance. These are not vague words or generic warnings, but an urgent cry from heaven that crosses decades and continents. Despite the apparitions, miracles, and fulfilled prophecies, humanity continues to act as if it had all the time in the world, ignoring that time is running out. The question resonates strongly in the souls of many believers. When will everything be revealed? When will the veils that cover the secrets of the divine plan be completely opened? The answer, although veiled, begins to take shape through the signs of the times. From the first days of the apparitions at Fatima in 1917, there was talk of a time of great tribulation if the world was not converted. The third secret, officially revealed in 2000, caused both confusion and skepticism, as many considered that the message seemed incomplete or that it did not reflect the drama that Sister Lucia had suggested in previous letters. The silence of the Vatican, the ambiguous interpretations, and the lack of a forceful call to conversion in that official revelation fueled the idea that something still remained to be revealed. Throughout the 20th century, various prelates, mystics, and seers have pointed out that there is a part of the message of Fatima that remains hidden, a prophecy that, if made public, would cause a global shock in the conscience of the Church and the world. But beyond the historical data or the specific content of a manuscript, the essential thing is to recognize the spiritual thread that unites all authentic revelations. There is an active waiting for heaven. It is not an indifferent passivity, but a mercy that lasts over time, as if the inevitable judgment could still find a humanity willing to respond. We are on the threshold of a great definition. The Virgin's messages are not limited to describing catastrophes, but insist that these events are preventable or at least mitigated if there is genuine repentance. Judgment should not be understood only as an external punishment, but as an internal revelation. Many today live as if God were far away, as if faith were a cultural inheritance rather than a living relationship. However, what is coming is a time when souls will be confronted face to face with the truth. The call to conversion is not an aesthetic or emotional invitation. It is a demand of divine love, which wants to save before it is too late. God's mercy does not contradict his justice. It anticipates it. Therefore, the longer the grace period extends, the more urgent it is to respond. In recent years, even outside the religious sphere, voices warning about a radical change in history have multiplied. The collapse of values, the increase in wars, environmental crises, earthquakes in unusual places, the rebellion of nature, the growing persecution of believers, everything seems to whisper that something is approaching. And in the midst of that chaos, one constant remains. The silence of heaven is not indifference, but waiting, a tense wait, full of love and warning. Heaven continues to trust in human freedom, although men do not seem to trust heaven. What has been revealed so far, and what is yet to be revealed, cannot be separated from personal responsibility. Prophecies are not there to satisfy curiosities, but to provoke decisions. God does not threaten, he calls. It doesn't terrify, it wakes up. And whoever hears that call knows that every day can be decisive. We may not have the exact date of the final fulfillment, but we do have the signs, the voices, the tears of Mary, and the echo of the saints who have warned of a time of purification. It is not necessary to know when if we are living as if it were now. Therefore, the call is to discernment. The Virgin did not speak for an intellectual elite or for students of eschatology, but for simple hearts that know how to recognize the signs and respond with faith. Prayer becomes the most urgent channel of communication with heaven, not only as a request, but as listening. Praying in these times is being vigilant. It is keeping the lamp of hope lit, even when everything seems dark. And it is in that deep prayer where the soul begins to sense that the moment is approaching. It is not just about being attentive to major geopolitical events or natural catastrophes. Sometimes the most revealing thing happens in the intimate. A shaking of the soul, a call to confess, an impulse toward the Eucharist, an inexplicable need to return to the gospel. Those are the surest signs that something is moving. The Virgin speaks in silence, and only those who silence the noise of the world can hear her clearly. Time is short, but there is still hope. We must not look to the future with fear, but with reverence. Every minute can be the border between blindness and light. The judgment that is coming is also an opportunity to see ourselves as God sees us, to finally embrace the truth and renounce everything that separates us from Him. And that judgment begins now, in every decision, in every hidden act, in every interior response to the call that resonates from Fatima until today. Maria is still waiting. Heaven has not closed its doors, but you can already hear the steps. The veil that covers the unrevealed is about to fall. And when everything is revealed, how will your heart be? And you? Do you feel like something invisible is already happening? Tell us if you also perceive that time is speeding up.